Those who advocate for reduced immigration are racist. This is because there are groups such as One Nation calling for immigration to stop because they want to prevent African and Middle Eastern people coming here. And unfortunately, we get tarred with the same brush. SPA finds itself at odds with human rights activists who tell us we are judging people in developing nations for having large families. It's not about judgment. We argue for a greatly increased overseas aid budget with a particular focus on family planning and contraception so that those in developing nations have a choice. Then the feminists attack us, saying we have no right to tell women how many children they can have. We agree. We know if education is provided to inform women of the opportunity to be able to control their own fertility, they put up their hands and say, yes, please. And even the men like the idea of having a little bit more money at their disposal by spacing births. Then fingers are pointed at coercive family planning, such as the former one-child policy of China, which resulted in forced sterilizations and severe punishment for those who broke the rules. But it's a non sequitur to suggest that those who advocate for reducing population size are arguing we should go down that path. Similarly, the Indian experiment where men were offered free transistor radios as a reward for having a vasectomy is not one to be replicated. SPA finds itself at odds with the Greens and those on the left of politics who wrongly argue the issue is not about population numbers but about overconsumption, when in fact it is both. Arguing that it's overconsumption is a cop-out because it lets population off the hook. We cannot have a sustainable future unless we address both. SPA often finds itself at odds with demographers, which is not surprising given their training is not based on understanding broader ecological processes and constraints. We find ourselves at odds with religious fundamentalists from Christianity to Islam who argue against family planning and work to prevent its access and distribution. Tom Giusevic pointed out that some of us hold the view that immigration is a Ponzi scheme, and he's correct. SPA does hold that view, which means we're up against the developers who are cashed up and ready to lobby for more and more immigration. So it's a gargantuan opposition we behold. Let's take a look at the economic side of this issue to see where the established pro-growth coalition described by Giusevic is coming from. In the movement for stabilising and reducing population growth, there is an oft-quoted equation to help understand what population does in concert with other factors. It's not a formula per se, but more an explanation. It goes I equals P times A times T, where I is the human impact, which is measured by taking P, population numbers, and multiplying that by A, which is affluence or levels of consumption, multiplied again by T, that's the technology used. It's not simple addition, it's cumulative. This means that the impact is increased by the amount of resources being used. That's the affluence. Wealthy nations like ours have enormous impact because of our levels of consumption. On the other hand, if we alter our technology, for example, switching from coal to solar, we can reduce some of the impact. And if there are fewer people consuming, then all the better to reduce the impact. One of the problems associated with affluent societies is the economic indicators we use. GDP is one of the principal indicators to measure economic growth, but it effectively measures the throughput of resources and therefore produces some lazy and crazy results. Take last year's massive bushfires. According to GDP measures, we are better off as a consequence of the deaths and the damage. Preposterous, but sadly true. When the fire trucks drove out to the fires, they used diesel to get them there, to pump the water, to put out the fires. That extra use of fuel was a benefit to the economy, measured by GDP. When people were burnt or injured and were treated in hospital, the use of the bandages and the medicines was a positive for the economy. It's gruesome, but that's what GDP measures. Everything destroyed has had to be replaced, creating greater demand for new fencing around rural properties, the replacement of electricity poles and wires, concrete pours, building materials, new cars and tractors, new curtains, new carpets, new furniture, replacement clothes, replacement kitchen utensils, and so on. The economy has greatly benefited. The economy is not always predictably gifted with such disasters. So how to create the demand for those same things in a non-crisis year? The solution politicians and developers turn to is the increasing of population numbers, and it is like drug addiction. They can never get enough. Ask any of them, and I've tried, at what point you turn the tap off, and they cannot answer. So how are population numbers to be increased? Firstly, governments can encourage the existing population to have more babies, which they did during the Howard government years with the baby bonus. And recently, our Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, blushed when asked about it, suggesting coyly it might be under consideration. The other way is to increase immigration, and for more than a decade, that's where the emphasis has been, with at least 60% of Australia's population growth coming from overseas. That's a ballpark figure of around 150,000 each year. SPA has a very different view. Given the number of people permanently leaving the country and average fertility rates, we say we can probably allow 50,000 people into Australia each year. Of those 50,000, SPA's view is around 20,000 would be allowed into the country for humanitarian reasons. From this, you can work out that a significant minority of the 50,000 would come from war-torn regions, nations with large populations, poverty and poor human rights records, many of them refugees. Our suggestion would produce a very multicultural result. Nevertheless, our 50,000 figure is hugely different to the 250,000 per annum Australia has been experiencing and which our current government wishes to revert to in a post-COVID economy. You're possibly asking why it's a bad thing to have an extra 250,000 people arriving here each year. It's because human numbers in Australia are already beyond the land's capacity to sustain them at our level of affluence. Australia's population mostly clings to the edges of our continent. 233 years after the arrival of British colonists, and despite all the advances in science and technology, we continue to do so. And there is good reason for it. The great bulk of Australia's land mass is inhospitable, with ancient soils lacking fertility, water almost completely unavailable, and growing hotter by the year because of climate change. Australia's 2016 State of the Environment report compared the conditions of Australia's natural environment from 2011 to 2016. Two words from the report are very important and they need to be distinguished: drivers and pressures. The key drivers of environmental change are population and economic activity, which in turn are creating the main pressures listed as climate change, land use change, habitat fragmentation and degradation, and invasive species. And all those pressures increased in those 5 years. The report noted that the number of species listed as threatened under the EPBC Act continues to rise. This observation was verified 2 years later by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in its 2018 IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. It showed a worsening of the situation, with 106 Australian species now threatened critically. The IUCN scientific investigations reveal that many of Australia's reptiles are facing severe threat from climate change, invasive species, and habitat loss from land clearing for development. Their list now contains 975 Australian reptile species, accounting for almost all our continent's reptiles. Australia's forests and woodlands are only half of what they were at the beginning of European settlement. Much of what's left is severely degraded and fragmented, and thus increasingly unsuitable for fauna because animals need to be able to safely move from one patch to another. The Australian Koala Foundation has no doubt the greatest threat to koalas in Queensland's southeast is loss of habitat due to land clearing and urban encroachment, both of which are human-induced. Between 2013 and 2016, more than 5,000 koalas died as a consequence of that clearing. The rate of land clearing in northern New South Wales more than tripled after the Berejiklian government eased native vegetation protection in 2017 to the rate of about 14 football fields of koala habitat per day. Australia is losing 2 million hectares of land to urban sprawl nationally. Jeffrey McKee, an anthropologist at Ohio State University, has stated, population as it grows squeezes out other species because people need space to live, and the other species need space to live. At some point, they come into juxtaposition and something has to give. So far, it hasn't been us. 6 years on from that statement, COVID-19 made its dramatic entry into our lives as a consequence of exactly that juxtaposition. In 2010, the Australian Conservation Foundation nominated population as a key threatening process to Australian biodiversity. It's unfortunate that the ACF is one of many environment groups that will no longer touch the issue of population growth. And we've had correspondence up with them about this, and they say it's because it's a divisive issue. They've even removed that nomination from their website. We cannot back away from issues simply because they are divisive, particularly if the future of the planet is at stake. Back then, the ACF suggested Australia could support more people, beginning with a somewhat plaintive caveat, if only. If only our planning systems, our patterns of consumption, our lifestyles, our environmental laws, our built infrastructure, and our relationship to technology were different, we would have a very much improved situation over the current state of affairs. But to assume that they will all occur on the scale and time frame needed to avert irrevocable pressure on our biodiversity would be rash indeed. That was 10 years ago, and as the science shows, things have only worsened. The writers of that nomination were correct to be pessimistic. As a nation, we have continued on the predicted trajectory, failing to learn from the information available to us. 10 years ago, our population was 22.3 million. Now it's 25.7 million, and more than 60% of that increase has come from immigration. Those arguing for Australia's human population numbers to continue increasing at this rate are arguing for environmental mayhem. As Tom Jusevic points out, Australia's population growth rate has at times been the highest in the world, although I think he meant the developed world. In the last decade, on a number of occasions, we've had the dubious honour of being the highest amongst OECD nations. Australia's growth rate was around 50% higher than North America's, 5 times that of Europe, larger than Indonesia, larger than India. We're on a par with South Sudan. In 1992, 1,700 of the world's leading scientists penned the World Scientist's Warning to Humanity. Their message was, human beings and the natural world are on a collision course such that the living world will be unable to sustain life in the manner we have come to know it, the damage being that such repair will be impossible. 25 years on, in December 2017, they published a second warning to humanity, supported this time by over 20,000 scientists in 184 countries, telling us we have unleashed a mass extinction event wherein many current life forms could be annihilated or at least committed to extinction by the end of the century. Scientists use their words carefully and often are not good at promoting their concerns, yet they speak of our imperiled biosphere, telling us soon it will be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. When that second warning was released, on behalf of SPA, I wrote to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull asking for the government's response. Admittedly, he had other things on his mind, such as the destabilisation of his leadership. And so in turn, our letter was inherited by the incoming Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who in turn sent it to the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister, Steve Irons, who advised us he was forwarding our letter to the new Minister for Population, Alan Tudge. Finally, 3.5 months after our initial letter, we had a reply of sorts, but it abysmally failed to address any of the concerns raised by those 20,000 scientists. Mr. Tudge responded, "Thank you for your letter about sustainable population growth." Does he live on another planet, I wondered? Because my letter was definitely not about that myth. He said, "A growing population presents opportunities and challenges, and the challenges were defined in terms of infrastructure to alleviate urban congestion, better transport links to connect cities and regions, to rapidly grow smaller regions, and a more robust population planning framework." Well, we're really doing great on those, aren't we? Nothing was said about the environment, nothing about energy technology, nothing about marine life depletion. It was a nothing reply. To my knowledge, this was the only response at Australia's highest level of government, demonstrating either an unwillingness to engage with the issues or an incapacity to understand them. I regarded it then, and still do, as being willfully blind, ignorant, and arrogant. Last March, Australia's Commission for the Human Future, led by Professor John Hewson, an economist and former leader of the Liberal Party, issued a report titled "Surviving and Thriving in the 21st Century." It identified 10 catastrophic risks the world is facing, population being one of them. The other 9 are climate change, environmental decline and extinction, nuclear weapons, I'll have a little bit to say about that shortly, resource scarcity, food insecurity, dangerous new technologies, chemical pollution, pandemic disease, and the political dimension, denial, misinformation, and failure to act preventively. The awful thing is that all 10 are working simultaneously in a dangerous combination, one feeding off another. Here's what the report says about population. A 4-fold increase in human numbers since the mid-20th century is the underlying driver of all the catastrophic risks we now face, combined with our overconsumption of scarce resources. A key question, therefore, is how can we slow both population growth and its impact in ways that can enable survival and prosperity for all? Limiting the human birth rate voluntarily is surely better than the alternative of a catastrophic dieback or the slaughter of billions of people, and for this reason must now be considered globally whether people or governments want to or not. The time has come for the world and individual countries, religions and cultures to consider in a mature and far-sighted way a universal, longer-term objective of reducing population growth as it presents a catastrophic risk to all humanity. The 20,000 scientists who signed the second warning to humanity referred to a mass extinction event, now simply known as the 6th extinction. It's different to earlier extinctions, which were caused variously by climate cooling or the Earth being hit by asteroids. It's different because this is the first time an extinction event on planet Earth has been caused by biological beings, us. We are threatening all other species, whether it be the 90% overfishing of our oceans, the destruction of forests, bushfires of an intensity never before experienced, the whirls and walls of giant masses of plastic in our oceans, or more simple things like the River Murray's flow stopping because of the silting up of the mouth and only constant dredging keeping it open. 40% of the world's surface has now been cleared to grow food for us. Our impact is enormous. The late physicist and Nobel laureate Dr. Henry W. Kendall said, "If we don't halt population growth with justice and compassion, it will be done for us by nature, brutally and without pity, and will leave a ravaged world." Dr. Guy McPherson of the University of Arizona put it even more provocatively: nature bats last. He says this is so because mammals cannot evolve fast enough to survive this extinction crisis. And we are mammals, by the way. We depend mostly on invertebrates for fertilizing the planet, which we in turn require for our food directly or indirectly. But an insect apocalypse is happening now, and fertilization is becoming problematic. Simply put, if the biology on which we depend cannot survive, then neither can we. The consequence for life on Earth is becoming entirely unpredictable. Just a week ago, another report came out from a group of 17 international scientists, including 2 Australians, in which they say population growth and material overconsumption will worsen all of the environmental problems besetting us. Yet, as a species, we seem unable to comprehend the magnitude of this. I understand if you prefer to walk away from this massive challenge. These are unpleasant things to hear. At the peak of my campaigning for the dismantling of nuclear weapons, when the doomsday clock was set at 90 seconds to midnight, ABC Radio's science show gave out a phone number for those wanting to leave a message about how they felt about it. By this stage, I'd been campaigning on the issue for 25 years. I'd organised rallies, I'd carried banners, I'd written and issued press releases for People for Nuclear Disarmament, and I'd chaired their meetings. I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I dialed the number, listened to the message to start talking after the beep. I opened my mouth, and instead of my considered message, I burst into tears. Yet, in 2 days' time, the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons comes into effect. Sadly, the Australian government has not signed onto it, but that's another story and another fight. But the message is, when the fight looked impossible, campaigners kept on campaigning. I've been charged to answer the question whether Australia's population should go big, and if so, how big. My answer is obvious. We must not go big, neither here nor anywhere else. At the very least, we must stabilise our population numbers. Going big takes us further down a pathway to destruction. We face choices. Do we shrug our shoulders and say, I can't do anything about it? If so, as the scientists tell us, the results will be catastrophic. Or will we instead take the fight up to our leaders, our politicians, and our opinion makers, forcing them into action, as has been happening on climate change? I understand why politicians turn a deaf ear to those of us calling for limits to growth. What political party would be courageous enough to go to an election promising to reduce our levels of consumption? What political party will reduce the money or reject the money from its donors and instead stand up for all life forms and not just well-advantaged humans? That's the realpolitik, I suppose, but for me, it's a bit like Reformation Catholic priest Martin Luther when he said to his inquisitors, "Here I stand, I can do no other." I hope some of you will feel the same. I thank you for your attention and for the opportunities to speak with you on this challenging topic. I await your questions with eagerness, and I look forward to hearing the results of your deliberations later today.